Welcome to LiveDaf, your online Daf Yomi Shiur.
Shalom, welcome back to today's Daf Yomi Shabbos Daf Tzadik Vav. We're right on top of the Amar at the first line. Says the Gemara, Amar of Asi, Shoinin. There were Tanoim who taught for us in a brayso as follows: Kli cheres shiuroi b'koyis mashka. A kli cheres, a earthenware kli, a kli made of pottery. If it receives a hole, what is the smallest hole which would nullify it somewhat from a kli status, from a status of utensil? Shiuroi b'koyis mashka. If the hole, the puncture is large enough, b'koyis mashka, to allow mashka liquids to seep in to the kli from the outside, this is sufficient to be mevatel the kli b'miktsas. Rashi says, somewhat mitoras kli. It is nullified to a small extent, as Rashi says, because the kli from now on will not be suitable to be used for meichatos, to be used to put the spring water into the kli, and which is part of the process of making the paraduma water, where they would put the ashes on the spring water. So this kli is no longer suitable for that purpose because it has a puncture of this size. The Brisa continues that the small size hole of moitzi mashke, which allows liquid to drip out, that size hole is not sufficient to nullify, to negate a complete kli. That shiur, that measure of moitzi mashke, that small size hole, only has the ability to negate, to mevatel a gistra. Gistra, Rashi says, is a shard, a small piece of cheres, which is a broken piece of cheres used to collect a drip from a leaking kli. So if this broken piece of cheres itself gets punctured, even with a small hole, a hole which is moitzi mashke, merely allows the liquid to trickle out, which is a smaller size hole than koines mashke, so the gistra thus becomes nullified from its use and is no longer mekabel tumah. So we have this distinction. If it is a complete kli, then we need a larger hole, a hole which allows water to seep in from the outside. So if you place the kli on water, for instance, the water would come in from the outside. So this is a larger size hole than merely the hole of moitzi mashke, which allows water to trickle out from it. That is not sufficient to negate a kli shalom, a full kli. That is only applied to a gistra, a piece of cheres. So if the piece of cheres receives this smaller hole, it becomes batel. Says, well, my timer. Why? Why, when a gistra acquires this small puncture, you nullify it? Amar marzuta b'yeder Nachman. Lefi shein oimrim. Nobody would say, have a gistra legistra, bring a piece of cheres to collect a leak coming from the other piece of cheres. So we don't use a backup for a backup. So once this piece of cheres gets this hole which allows the water to leak out from it, it's nullified, it's no longer suitable for use. One would not take another gistra to protect this one. Let's take a look at Rashi inside. Right off to the side, which is 6 lines from the top. She'ein oimrim have gistra acheres. Nobody would go ahead and bring another, and say, bring another gistra, legistra zu, to go ahead and collect something dripping out of this gistra. To place underneath it, lekabel atifin, to collect the leak. But a complete whole kli chasen alav, one cares for it. One would not simply discard it when it has a small hole. Umishum nekav porta lo shadolei, when it receives a small hole which allows water to leak out of it, which is a much smaller hole than the halacha of koines mashke, allowing the water to seep in. So it's merely a small hole which allows water to leak out. One will not get rid of the kli, or manichan gisra tachtav. One will place a gisra, a piece of cheres, underneath it to collect the leak. So that is the basis for this chiluk of a full kli, which needs a larger hole to nullify it, whereas a gisra, there it's sufficient even if it only gets punctured with a smaller size hole. Continues the Gemara Amrula. There's actually machlokes between two Amoraim in Marav and Eretz Yisrael, between Rabbi Yosi bar Avin and Rabbi Yosi bar Zavta, between these two Amoraim. So this was pertaining to the halacha of hechsher zroim. So we learned in Tzaddik that if edible produce gets wet through the 7 primary liquids, water, dew, honey, etc., it becomes susceptible to Kabbalah's Tumah. From here on in, it can be Kabbalah Tumah, can contract Tumah, provided that this produce is disconnected from the earth, it's detached. But if it's still growing, then it cannot become Hukshel Kabbalah Tumah. Otherwise, every apple growing on a tree would be susceptible to Tumah, so it needs to be detached from the ground. Now, what if something is growing in an atzitz, in a kli, which so the plant is growing in the kli. Now, if the kli is whole and complete without any perforation, certainly anything growing within it is considered to be detached from the ground and can theoretically become unable to become tumah, can become huksha if it gets wet. What if the kli has a puncture as a hole? So we're going to discuss now, depending on the size of the hole, perhaps we're going to regard anything growing within this flower pot as though it's connected to the ground, is considered to be mechuber, and cannot become enabled for tumah. So what size hole is required? So machlokes is between Rabbi Yosef bar Avin and Rabbi Yosef bar Zavda. Chad Omar ki moitzi riman. If the hole is a size, excuse me, one holds if the hole is the size of a moitzi riman, which allows the pomegranates to slip out, in that case, anything growing within it is regarded as though it is connected to the ground, and therefore cannot become hukshel kabatum. The other shita holds kisherish cotton, as long as the hole has the size of a sherish cotton, a small root, that is sufficient to regard the item planted within this flower pot as though it's connected to the ground with regards to hechsher tumah. V'simanach, let's give you a simon, a memory aid to remember this wide gap between these two shitas, between the large hole which allows the pomegranate to fall through and the small hole for the root. Echad hamar v'echad hamamet. This is actually a Mishnah in the end of Menachos, where the Mishnah tells us that it doesn't matter, one who gives a lot to Hashem, one who gives a large carbon, a small carbon, it's irrelevant as long as the kavanah, the intention, the heart is there. So this is a simon, large, very large and very small. Here as well we have a wide gap between these two extreme opinions. When it comes to hechsher zroim, we have the moitzi rimoin, which is a large hole for the pomegranate, and this is in contrast to the much smaller share of the sherish cotton, of the small root. So this is the second halacha we learned. When it comes to enabling the content of a flower pot to be makabel tumah, to be susceptible for tumah, it needs to be detached. If it is somewhat attached to the ground, then at that point it's no longer susceptible for tumah until it gets detached. Now the flower pot that has a hole, we regard the item within it that attached, provided the hole is large enough either for a rimoin or for a sherish cotton. Continues the Gemara, Amar of China bar Kahanim Shvend Rav Eliezer, Kli cheres shi'urei k'moitzi zeisim. How can we nullify a kli cheres from tumah completely? If it has a hole, if it attains a hole, a puncture, which is large enough to allow the zeisim, the olives, to fall through. Umar Kshisha, Brei de Rabba, so Makshisha, the son of Rabba, Messiah, he concluded this halacha, Mishmei de Rav Eliezer, as follows. In the name of Eliezer as follows. Varei hein. So these kalim which were punctured in this manner, which allow the olive to fall through, these kalim are completely negated and nullified from their kli status. They're no longer makabel tumah, kiklei glolim, as though they are made of dung, made of animal waste, uklei avonim, stoneware, uklei adama, clay utensils made of clay which was not heated in a kiln. So these are not makabel tumah at all. She'ein makabel tumah, loy midivei Torah, v'loy midivei sofrim. They're not makabel tumah, not susceptible to tumah, neither midivei Torah, biblically, or midrabanan. They're completely tar. So Rashi explains that the chiddush here is, even if he designates this kli cheres to be used for large size items, for instance, to contain remaining pomegranates, it's irrelevant. Once this kli cheres has become punctured to this extent, which allows the zayis to fall through, it's completely nullified, negated, is no longer makabel tumah. And this actually is a machlokes, because this is in dispute of Rava, who taught us on Daf Tzadikei that if the Kli would be miyuchad l'rimonim, designated for rimonim, then it would not become negated completely because it's still useful for pomegranates. Therefore, it's still mekabel tumah, even though it receives this hole with this puncture which allows the zayis to fall through. But it all depends on the function and the use of the Kli. So if it's designated to be used for rimonim, then the Kli is still mekabel tumah. So this sheet here disagrees and holds that halacha of designation only applies to a more important, prominent type of Kli, like a Kli eitz, made of wood. But a Kli cheres, once it receives this size hole, it's completely negated, nullifies its Kli status, and is no longer mekabel tumah. Concludes the Gemara, a fourth halacha, l'inyan tzomit pasel. However, when it comes to the halacha of tzomit pasel, this was where the Kli cheres is sealed and it has the ability to protect its content from tumah even when it's sitting under the same roof as a mace. In that case, even if it has a large hole, it can still protect its content achi pachis ruba until most of the Kli becomes broken off. As Rashi explains, because the tumah does not enter the Kli cheres from the outside, only derech pesach, through its opening, through its mouth. So even if it's placed in an oil hames, the tumah does not enter through the various holes. Since the opening, the pesach, the mouth, is sealed with its summit puzzle, with a seal which is completely sealed, completely tightly sealed to it, that is sufficient to protect the contents from tumah. So even though there's a hole on the side, it's irrelevant. But that's only up until a certain point. Once it becomes mostly cracked off, ashi pachis ruba, most of the Kli is disintegrated and broken off, certainly there's no Kli present, and it cannot protect its content. Okay, to summarize, we learned 4 halachas. The first thing we learned was that a gisra, a broken piece of cheretz, was used to collect a leak. If it itself is leaking, it is tar. When it comes to considering the thing planted inside a flower pot as connected to the ground with regards to hechsher zroim, to protect it from susceptibility to tumah. So if the atzitz, if this flower pot has a hole, whether according to one sheet to the size of a small root, or according to the other sheet to the size of a pomegranate, then we regard the content of this Kli as though it's attached to the ground and is immune from tumah. We learned that according to this shita today, a Kli cheres, which was punctured the size of has a hole the size of a zayis, is completely nullified, negated from Kli status, which is actually opposing Rav's shita, who tells us that if this Kli was designated for rimonim, then it still maintains its tumah status. And finally, we learned that a Kli cheres, which is in a oil hames and sealed properly with its summit puzzle, so its mouth is properly sealed and covered, it will protect its content even if it has a hole, until the Kli is yipachis rubai, is mostly broken off. Hadron Allah chamatznia. Continues the Mishnah. So we know that there's a malach of Haitzah. Haitzah carries something from one rishus to the other. From rishus hayachid, private domain, to rishus harabim, a public domain, is considered to be a malacha deraisa av malacha, a primary malacha. Now we're going to learn in the Mishnah and the upcoming Gemara that just as other malachas have avos and toilades, derivatives, this malacha as well has toilades. For instance, zrika, throwing. That's not actually carrying something, it's throwing. It's considered to be a teilada of the malacha of hamaitzi. Let's see the Mishnah. Hazorek mishus hayachid rishus harabim. If one should throw an object from rishus hayachid out to rishus harabim, or in the reverse, mishus harabim rishus hayachid chayav, it's considered to be a teilada of the malacha of hamaitzi mishus rishus, transferring an object from one domain to the other, and he's chayav. What about mishus hayachid l'rishus hayachid? If he throws something from one private domain to the other private domain, and he throws it through the airspace of Rishus Harabim in between, Rabbi Akiva Machayev, he says, this case as well is considered to be a malacha and he's liable. Say he's pater. The Gemara will explain several approaches to this machlekes. Continues the Mishnah. So according to Chachamim, if he throws something through the airspace of Rishus Harabim, he's pater. Ketzad. What is an example of this? Shteigzus trois. So if he has 2 balconies, that are opposite each other, on two sides, two opposite sides of Shus Rabim. HaMoishid, if one should hand an object from one balcony to the other through the airspace of Shus Rabim, V'Azorik, or would throw Mizul Azu from one to the other, Pater, in accordance with the Shita of the Chachamim. Because it hadn't landed in Shus Rabim, we know that for the Melacha, there are two requirements, Akira and Hanacha. It needs to be lifted from one Rishus and placed down, Munach on the other Rishus. In this case, the Chacham maintained there's no Melacha that's taking place because the item is simply passing through the Rishus Rabim. There was no Hanacha, never landed in Rishus Rabim, so it began in Rishus HaYachid and ended in Rishus HaYachid, therefore there's no Melacha. Continues the Mishnah, but there's a Chiddush. If both of these balconies were actually situated alongside the Rishus Rabim, alongside the length of Rishus Rabim. So picture as follows: you have two buildings built alongside the Rishus Rabim, with the Rishus Rabim running alongside them, and you have two balconies protruding from these buildings into Rishus Rabim. So once again, you have the building, two balconies, and the Rishus Rabim going alongside it. Says the Mishnah, so if both balconies were on one row, alongside the length of Rishus Rabim, in this case we have a distinction. If one was to pass something from one balcony over to the other, and it is passing through the airspace of Rishus Rabim, which is right underneath the balconies, but since it's alongside the Rishus Rabim, they're not on both opposite sides of Rishus Rabim, but they're alongside Rishus Rabim, in this case, there's a Chiddush. If one passes, he's chayiv. V'azorik pater. But if you should throw from one to the other, he's pater. Why? Says the Mishnah, Shakach hoisa avodas halavim. Because the avodah of the Levim, the labor of the Levim, when they dismantled the Mishkan, they transported the crushing, the beams in the Midbar, they did it in this manner. Explains the Mishnah. Shtei agolis zu achazu b'shus rabim. So they had two wagons parked, two behind each other in Rishus Rabim. As Rashi explained the whole configuration, so they were near the Mishkan, and they would transfer the Krushim from the Mishkan over to the first set of wagons, and then the Levi would take the Keresh, the beam, and pass it over to the wagon behind him. Shtei agoles, there were two wagons, zu achar zu, situated behind each other, two sets of two, b'shus rabim, moishitin akroshim zozu, so they would pass over the Krushim from one set of wagons to the ones behind it. Avaloi zarkin, they wouldn't throw it. So this is the source of this chiddush, of this halacha, this novel halacha, that even according to the Rabbanon, there is a specific case in which one can be chayiv even without doing a hanacha rishus rabim. If he merely passes from one rishus hayachad to the other, and he's passing it over the airspace of rishus rabim, provided that it's being done along the length of rishus rabim, which is resembles the labor, the avodah of the Levim, who would also do the same. They would pass the Krushim from one wagon, which was Sayachet, over the airspace of Rishus Rabim, over to the wagon situated behind it. So they were both alongside the length of Rishus Rabim. So since this was done in the Midbar, we know that the Malachas of Shabbos are derived from the Midbar, from the Mishkan. Therefore, the Chiddush here is that he would be chayiv due to passing. But the Mishnah concludes, this is strictly when it comes to passing, avaloi zarkin. But in the Mishkan, in the Midbar, the Levim wouldn't throw the beams. Rashi says they were too heavy. There's another version because of the kavod, the respect, out of respect for the crushing of the Mishkan, so they wouldn't throw it. Therefore, this halacha is unique to passing, but not to throwing in accordance with the Shis Chachamim. That throwing across the Rabim is not considered to be a malacha. Let's see Rashi inside, who explains the background of the Mishnah. Let's begin from Rashi, from the beginning of the Mishnah. Beginning with the words Hazorik. Rabbi Akiva Machayev, Taimam Mafarish. The Gemara explained the reason for Rabbi Akiva's liability. Ketzad Shteg Zestrois. So here the Mishnah is describing for us Rabbanu Kamrilu. So this is the Rabbanu speaking. So we have two Zestrois, two balconies. Zizin, these balconies, these beams, Hayetzim Nakaisel, coming out, protruding from the wall, over Rishus Rabim. They placed planks upon them for walking. Zu keneged zu, so both balconies were opposite each other. On both opposite sides of Rishus Rabim. and the balconies are considered to be legally Rosh Hashanah Shekvayis Yud. V'Ruchav is Dal, they're 10 tefachim high off the ground, and they're wide 4 tefachim, so they are regarded as Rosh Hashanah. So the Mishnah tells us if one should go ahead and transfer from the 2 balconies situated on the 2 opposite sides of Rosh Hashanah, Potter, we don't find in the Mlechas HaMishkan this type of activity of throwing and passing from one Rosh Hashanah to the other, from one Rosh Hashanah over to the other with the width of Rosh Hashanah coming between them. Meaning we don't find passing or throwing over the Rosh Hashanah, over the width of Rosh Hashanah. This wasn't the manner of the work of the Levim, to pass crushim, beams from one wagon to the wagon situated adjacent to it, alongside it. Only they would pass to the agala, which was lefoneo, shlachareo, in front of it or behind it. So they wouldn't pass over to the adjacent wagon, the one that was right beside it. Rather, they would pass it ahead or behind to the agala placed before or behind it. Explains Rashi. Sha'arba agala is hoyel of Bnei Merari. So there were 4 wagons for the Bnei Merari, for the Levim, she'inosim karsha Mishkan, which they would use for carrying the Mishkan, because they, she'hoyu noisim karsha Mishkan, they, the Bnei Merari, were the ones who would carry the Mishkan, carry the beams of the Mishkan. Vein holchin, now these wagons would travel in this manner. Shtayim ka'achad, zu b'tzadzu. They would travel in pairs. Because I mean in the Gemara, ukshoyu perkins HaMishkan, litan ala golis. Now when they would dismantle the Mishkan to load up the wagons, so they would park the wagons, they would prepare them in the configuration in which they would be traveling. So they would have a pair sitting next to the Mishkan, one next to the other, side by side, and 2 side by sides in front of them. So this was prepared for their trip. They would prepare in the way which they would go ahead and travel. Because they wanted to follow the Amud Anan, this cloud beam that was leading the way. So once again, they would have the Mishkan here, and this was the Rosh Hashanah, so to speak. This was the path, the road that they were going to take. So they had two agalis here, side by side, and another 2 agalis right in front of them. And this was the configuration in which they would go ahead and travel. So they would load up the agalis with the crushim, and then they would begin their trip, following them with honor. Says Rashi, Uperkia Mishkan, those that would dismantle the Mishkan, they would pass over the beams, Lo'oisan, to those Sha'al Shtei Agalis, Hasmuchas LaMishkan, they would pass the beams over to the people standing on the 2 wagons, which were side by side next to the Mishkan, Vehein Moishitin Loisan Shalafneim, and they would take the beams and pass it further to the 2 wagons situated directly in front of them. So we see that they would pass along the length of Rosh Hashanah. They would take something from Rosh Hashanah, a wagon with Rosh Hashanah, from one Rosh Hashanah over to the other Rosh Hashanah, passing over the airspace of Rosh Hashanah, but along the length of Rosh Hashanah. Aval, says Rashi, Agola Shabbatzida, they would never pass to the Agola which was side by side, which was next to it. There was no need for them to do that. Because both wagons were right near the Mishkan, right near the dismantles of the Mishkan. There was no need to go put something on one Agola and transfer it to the Agola, which was right beside it. So the transfer took place in this method. They would take the Keresh, they would place it on the first Agola, the Rosh Hashanah placed next to the Mishkan, and then the Levi would go ahead and pass it further to the Agola, which was further down the Rosh Hashanah. So they would in fact be passing from one Rosh Hashanah over to the other Rosh Hashanah, passing the airspace of Rosh Hashanah, but this was strictly along the length of the Rosh Hashanah. Continues the Mishnah, if both balconies were along one side of Rosh Hashanah, they were the second floor, alongside the length, so Once again, we're speaking about the balconies, which were situated, protruding from the houses, built alongside one side of Shiur Daf, and there's some airspace of Shiur Daf underneath these balconies. In this case, Hazorik Pater, if one throws his Pater, it's higher than 10 Tfachim. We don't find a similar situation of throwing from one Rishis Yachid to the other. We don't find this concept of throwing by the Mishkan, whether it's alongside the length of Rishis Rabbim or whether it's over the width. We don't find the concept of throwing. So throwing in any case is exempt. But if he passes, he's chayav. Because we do find a similar case of passing. Even if it was above 10 tfachim, above the airspace of Shiur Daf, we know that Shiur Daf only extends up until 10 tfachim. So we find even a concept of passing above the airspace of Shiur Daf, above 10 tfachim, from one Shiur Daf to the other, having some of the length of Shiur Daf between them, as we explained earlier, because this was the work, this was the labor, the form in which they would transfer the crush of the Mishkan, as the Mishnah explains. Where did we find this? Because when they had the two pairs of wagons, one behind the other, Mishkan, the dismantles of the Mishkan, they would pass they would pass the carriage to the immediate agolis, and they in turn would pass it further to the ones situated down Shiur Daf. So this indeed is the source of this halacha, but they would pass, but they wouldn't throw. Why? They're too heavy to be thrown. Or as there's another girsa here, it's actually a Yerushalmi, that it would be degrading bizayin to the crushim to throw them. So we don't find throwing in this context, and therefore we learn from here that if one would pass, he's chayav, but if he throws, he's pat. So in summary, we learned that if a person throws an object from one rishus to the other, he's chayiv. Whether it's Rishus Yachid to Rishus Rabbim or vice versa, he's chayiv. What if one throws from one Rishus Yachid through the airspace of Rishus Rabbim over to the other Rishus Yachid, with having landed Rishus Rabbim, according to Rekiv, he's chayiv, according to Chacham, he's pater. What if he passes from one Rishus Yachid to the other Rishus Yachid over the airspace of Rishus Rabbim? We're speaking about B'dyuta Achas. They're both alongside, they're both situated along the length of Rishus Rabbim. All agree in this case is chayiv, as we learn from the avodah of the Mishkan. Continues the Gemara. Michti, let's think, let's take a look. Zrika Tolda Daitzai. Apparently Zrika is a Telada derivative of Eitzah. Let's take a look at Rashi. Up on top, Michti says Rashi, Zrika Telada Daitzah. Al Karcha, you must say Teladi. That Zrika is a derivative. The Nimnis, B'Avas Malachis, it wasn't listed in the Avas Malachis. But Telada Daitzai, apparently it's a derivative of Eitzah, of carrying an object, manually carrying it out. Zrika, throwing, is considered to be, it resembles that. Ma'isa is considered to be a telada. She'enachal esita teledas av acher, because you can't attribute it to a different av. The me'en hoitzai, because it resembles carrying out. Hamura b'avis malachis, so it resembles the malach of Eitzah, which is listed in the avis malachis. So apparently, says the Gemara, we must conclude that Zrika is a telada of Eitzah. Let's take a look at the Gemara again. Michli, let's take a look. Zrika telada d'Eitzah. Apparently, Zrika is a telada derivative of Eitzah. Eitzah gufa hechaksiva. Now that you've determined that Eitzah is the av malacha, the primary malacha, carrying out an item from Shesach to Shesram is considered to be the av malacha. What is the source of this malacha? Now, right away, Tais asks Akasha, what do you mean? We found it in the Mishkan, and we know that the malachas are learned from the Mishkan. Says Tais, nevertheless, Eitzah is different than other malachas, because it is a malacha grohi. It's an inferior malacha, merely transferring an item from one domain to the other. It's not a significant malacha. It's not forming, it's not fashioning, it's crafting anything. So it's a malacha grohi. Therefore, we need another source. We need actually a pasuk the Gemara is going to bring to prove to us that this as well is considered to be a malacha, one of the 39 malachas. Haitzah gufa hechaksiva. Where do we find a source that carrying out an item from Rishus Yachid to Rabbim manually carrying it out is considered to be a malacha. Hechak siva. As it says in the pasuk, Vayitzav Moshe commanded, Vayaviru kol b'machna. They set forth a sound, an announcement in the machna, and they told them to stop bringing the contributions, the nedavos for the Mishkan. Explains the Gemara. Moshe heichan hava Yosef. Where was Moshe situated? B'machna Leviyah, in the encampment of the Levim. U'machna Leviyah, Rishus Rab Mavoy. Now we know that that area was considered to be Rishus Rab, a public domain. Rashi explains because everybody was there to learn Torah. It was a populated area. It's considered to be Rishus Rab. So now when Moshe made this announcement, he says, announce to all, stop bringing these contributions. He told Klal Yisrael, don't bring out and bring from your private domains, from your tents. Don't bring items and objects to me, to Rishus Rabim. So apparently he's telling them that they may not do this malacha v'eitzah because it's one of the malachas on Shabbos. Says, how do you know it's on Shabbos? How do you know you're speaking about on Shabbos? Perhaps it was an ordinary weekday. Why was he telling them to stop bringing? Not due to any malacha concerns, but rather mishum, because the shlimul malacha, because the work, the labor, meaning the effort, the donation effort has completed. It was sufficient. They didn't need any more materials for the Mishkan. It says, so the work was completed, the donations was completed. So perhaps that's the reason why they should stop bringing their nedavos, unrelated to Shabbos. Says the Gemara, we have Gzeir Shava, which teaches us, yes, this is Shabbos related. Gomar ha'avara miyam kippurim. We use Gzeir Shava to connect the term of Vayaviru to the term of Avarta, which is stated in the context of Yom Kippur. We learn Gzeir Shava one for the other. Gomar ha'avara miyam kippurim. Ksiv hacha. In our pasuk it says Vayaviru kol ha'machna. Ksiv hasam. And elsewhere it says Avarta shefer trua. You meant to sound the shofar, the broken shofar. So it's on Yom Kippur of the 50th year of Yovel, actually. So they blew the sound of the shofar. So we apply the concept of Gzeir Shava, Mala Halon B'Yom Asa, just like over there. The context is a day which is prohibited from Malacha, Yom Kippur. Afkan here too, when the Torah uses the term Vayaviru, which is similar to Va'avarta, we use the Gzeir Shava to teach us that here as well, it was on a day of Shabbos, Afkan B'Yom Asr, a day which was Asr to do Malacha. And indeed, the pasuk here is telling us that Moshe Rabbeinu announced, he told them, he announced that they should go ahead and make this announcement to tell them to stop bringing their Malacha, stop bringing their donations, because it is Shabbos. And one cannot carry out from the tent, which is Sayachid, to the Machna Leviyah, which was just a Rab. So, in summary, this is the Makar, this is the source of the Av Malacha Vaitzah, the pasuk which says, Vayitzav Moshe commanded. Vayivru kol ha'machna, as a result, they announced this announcement. Stop bringing, don't do a Malacha Vaitzah because it's Shabbos. Continues the Gemara, Ashkechan Vaitzah. Okay, so we found the source, a Makar, for the Av Malacha Vaitzah. What about Hachnosa Menalam? What about carrying in from Rishus Rabim to Rishus Hayachid? How do we know that's a malacha? This is more svari. It's logic. It's a svar michti. Let's take a look. He's transferring from one domain to the other. Mali afuki, umali ayuli. What difference does it make whether he's carrying out from the Yachid to the Rabim, or ayuli he's bringing in from the Rishus Rabim to Rishus Hayachid? So this is learned from a svara. It's a logical presentation. Says the Gemara, nevertheless, although Hachnasa is learned from a Svara, Miu, nevertheless, Haitzah Av, carrying out to Rishus Rabim is considered to be the primary Malacha. That's learned from a Pasuk. Hachnasa, bringing in from Rishus Rabim to Rishus Yachid, is still only going to be a Tolda derivative. Because that's not learned from a Pasuk, merely from a Svara. Says the Gemara, Umichti. Now let's take a look further, let's analyze. Aha machayiv, v'aha machayiv. An haitzah is chayiv, an achnos is chayiv. As Rashi brings the first Mishnah, Shabbos Daf Beis, we know that the Ani with the Baal Bayis, they exchanged items. The Mishnah clearly tells us that it doesn't matter which direction it's going, whether inter Rishis Rabim or inter Rishis Yachid, it's considered to be a malacha and he's chayiv. So why label this one Av, this one a Toda? What difference does it make? Amai Karla Hay Av. Why does he call this one an Av? V'amai Karla Hay Toda. Why the other one is called a Toda? Says one Nafkamina. There is a halachic ramification. As Rashi explains, this Nafkamina will be applied to all of its malachis. What is the definition between Av? What is the difference between Av and Toda? What is the difference of whether we label as an Av or a Toda? Says the Gemara, Di Avid, Shtei Avos B'Ad Adadi. If a person will perform two primary malachis in conjunction, he does them with one helam achas, in one with one unawareness, one lapse of awareness. Inami, alternatively, Shtei Tolas B'Ad Adadi, he does two derivatives together, Mechayiv Tarti. He needs to bring two karbanis. They are regarded as two separate, distinct malachis. However, V'i Avid Av Toda Didei, if a person would do an Av and a Toda in conjunction, so he does them both in one go, he's only chayiv one chatas on both, because the Toda does not have its own liability. It doesn't have its own independent chiv, separate from the Av. So if a person should be over, transgress an Av, and its own Toda, within this one period of unawareness, he will only be chayiv one chatas. So here's an afkamina, why we label something an Av, and the other thing a Toda, is an afkamina for this halacha. Says the Gemara, Ulu Rabbi Lezer, the mechayiv atol makamav. But according to Shittas Rabbi Lezer, who does not hold of this halacha, he holds that there's a separate chiv for Toda, even when done together with the Av. If so, amai karla Av, amai karla Toda. Back to the kasha. Why call this Av? Why Toda? What difference does it make? Says the reason is as follows: Hachtava b'mishkan chashiva. Any malacha which was considered to be a significant malacha in the Mishkan, karla Av, that is called an Av. Hachta loy havoy b'mishkan chashiva. However, something which was not considered to be a significant malacha in the Mishkan, loy karla Av, that is not called an Av, rather it's called a Toda. So even though it did take place in the Mishkan, but since it wasn't a significant form of labor in the Mishkan, it didn't have the proper chashivas, that is regarded merely as a Toda. Inami, another pshat, as Hezes points out, this pshat, the second pshat, specifically pertains to our discussion of a malacha v'eitzah. Why is Heitzah called an Av, and Achnasa bringing in to Shesayachad called a Toda? Says the Gemara, Hachta Ksiva, the activity which is sourced in a pasuk, like Heitzah, Kari Av, that is called an Av. V'haidel Ksiva, however, the other thing which is not written, for instance, Achnasa, Kari Toda, that is called a Toda. So at this point in the Gemara we have Heitzah carrying out the Rishis Rabim, which is called a primary malach on Av, whereas Achnasa is regarded as a Toda. And as we began the Gemara on top of the Amid, Zrika as well is considered to be a Toda of Heitzah. The Gemara will proceed with another example of a Toda of Heitzah. Says the Gemara, now this that we learned in the Mishnah, if one takes a glob, for instance, a fig, which will get stuck to the wall, so he throws it against the wall. He throws it 4 amas, at a distance of 4 amas in Rishis Rabim, against the wall. So if it gets stuck on the wall above 10 tefachim mark, l'malam yitfachim, kazerg ba'aver, that's not reckoned with. It's as if he threw it up in the air and never landed, because Rishis Rabim only extends up until 10 tefachim. L'matam yitfachim, however, if it lands below the 10 tefachim mark, so it gets stuck on the wall below the 10 tefach mark, kazerg ba'aretz, that is regarded as if he threw it on the ground. Va'azoreg ba'aretz, dal damas chayv. Indeed, if one should throw an object at a distance of 4 amas on the aretz of Rishis Rabim is chayv. Says the Gemara, zoreg dal damas Rishis Rabim minal dem chayv. What is the source for this chayv? Amar Rabbi Yosha shekein erge yiriyos, because the weavers of the curtains of the Mishkan, zorkim machtein zelazeh, they would throw their needles one to the other. So they would throw it at a distance of 4 amas Rishis Rabim. So this is the source of this chiyuv. Says the Gemara, Ergen, the weavers, machten lamelu, why do they need needles? They're using looms. Ella rather, shkein toifiriyos. The sewers, the ones who would embroider the yiriyos, who needed the needles, So they would throw their needles one to the other. Says the Gemara, V'dilma, maybe, perhaps they were sitting in close proximity to each other. They didn't need to throw it too far. Says the Gemara, it can't be. Because if they sit too close, they would prick each other with their needles. So apparently they need to sit apart from each other. And as a result, they would need to throw their needles at a distance. Says the Gemara, okay. So they didn't sit right on top of each other, but perhaps they were sitting within 4 amos of each other, and they didn't need to throw their needles at a distance of 4 amos. Because the weavers, they would throw the buchya. This is a shuttle which contains the spool of the chut erev, of the horizontal thread. So they would toss it in between the 2 sections of the of the vertical threads. So they would throw the buchya through, which contained the horizontal thread. They would throw it through, and apparently they threw it at a distance of 4 amos, and this was a Shiur Daf. So we find the source of this malach. Says the Gemara, even if they would throw it through the loom, but this shuttle, this buchya, which contained the loom, which was unraveling, when he threw it, he was still holding on to the thread, which was protruding from this tool. So it was still somewhat in his hand. He didn't actually let go completely of this tool. That's not considered to be zrika or Shiur Daf. Says the Gemara, Benischa basra. Let's bring a raya from the last section, the last piece of thread, when it completely unraveled. So the buchya went flying. It just let go. At that point, we have a zrika, a 4 amos Shiur Daf. Says the Gemara, why is it Shiur Daf? In between the sections of the loom here, there is no width of 4 tefachim. It's considered to be an exempt domain. It doesn't have a din of Shiur Daf. Ella, rather, will bring a raya from another scenario. So the weavers of the uriyas would throw the buchya, this tool, this container, to ones who needed to borrow it. So they would toss it one to the other and do zrika of the aldamas Shiur Daf in that manner. Says once again, V'dilma, perhaps they were sitting in close proximity to each other. That can't be. Because they would bump into each other when they would stretch, when they would tighten the hem of their curtains. They needed a stretching space for that. So it can't be that they would be sitting right next to each other. Says Zimmer, nevertheless, we can figure out a way they can sit next to each other. Perhaps they were sitting staggered. So they were sitting next to each other, but in a manner which they didn't interfere with each other's work. So you have no raya that they would throw something at a distance of 4 amos. V'su, another kasha. Can you maintain that they would indeed borrow from each other? Vatani Luda. Luda had taught us a brisa. Ish ishim malachta Hashem ha'isim. The pasuk says that the Chachamim came, each person came in malachta Hashem ha'isim. We learn from there. He would only use his personal tools to do his craft. He wouldn't use his friend's tools. Each one was fully equipped. So this whole phenomenon didn't exist. They didn't lend each other their tools. Visu, another kasha. Maver dal damas, b'Shiur Daf. What about carrying? So we discussed throwing. Perhaps you have a raya from the Mishkan, but what about carrying, taking an object and walking with it 4 amos Shiur Daf? Minol the Mechayiv. What is the source for that? That there's a chiyuv there as well. We certainly have no raya to that from the craftsman. Ella, says the Gemara, rather one answer for both difficulties. We're going to have one source for both halachas, for throwing and carrying. Kol dal damas Shiur Daf, any transfer of 4 amos in Shiur Daf, whether through carrying or through throwing, Gemara Gmirla, is something we learned from a tradition. It was taught to us, brought down halacha l'Moshe misinai. So in summary, we know that Haitzah is considered to be an Av Malacha, that is sourced in the pasuk of Haitzah Moshe. Vayivriu kol b'machan, they should cease bringing their donations into Shiur Daf because it was Shabbos. We have 3 toldos: throwing from one rishus to the other. As Taisa explained, that's learned from a svara. Achnasa, bringing in from a Shiur Daf, that too is learned from a svara. And finally, transferring 4 amos in Shiur Daf, that is learned from Lachem Hashem Sinai. And these 3 last things, Zrika, Achnasa, and Aldamis, are considered to be a tolda of the Malacha of Itzah. Continues the Gemara, Amar Vidam Shmuel. Mekoshish, the pasuk tells us there was a certain person that they discovered, Imtzu Ish Mekoshish Eitzim Yom Shabbos. So he was doing some sort of activity with wood. Mekoshish generally means gathering. So the pasuk tells us that he was desecrating Shabbos, he was Chal Shabbos, and they punished him. They gave him a Chiv Misa. Now, what exactly was he doing? Which malacha was he transgressing? We have a three-way machlekes. Amar b'dam Shmuel Mekoshish Maver Arba'amas b'Shusram Hava. He was transferring. He was carrying the wood 4 amas to Shusram. That was his aver. Masi Satana, when a Bryce we learned. Toila Shava. He plucked. He detached. He cut the wood off the ground, and he did a malacha of Toila Shava, of kaitza, of reaping. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar Ma'amava. The malacha that he committed was ma'amar. He gathered the wood together. So you have 3 opinions: maver al ba'amis b'shus ravim, toilish, or ma'amar. Says more l'maynaf kamina. What's the difference? What exactly he did there? Says more l'kadirav, pertaining to the statement of Rav. Damarav matzase migil astar be'Rav Chia. I found a hidden scroll by Rav Chia. Rashi explains that at that point in time they didn't yet record the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah. However, if a person heard a very interesting, a certain halacha that he was afraid that it was going to be forgotten, so he would privately record it and conceal the scroll. He wouldn't disseminate it. So Rav says, I found this specific scroll, the Kosabeh, and recorded in it was as follows: Isi ben Yehuda Eimer, Avos Malachis, Arbaim Chasar Achas. So there are 40 minus 1, 39 Avos Malachis, and it continued to say as follows: Ve'ein chayav ala achas. He's only liable for one. There's one liability on all, says the Gemara. Now apparently we're not speaking about doing it intentionally b'mezid, because certainly there's no chiddush. How could he get more than one chiv misa? Apparently we're speaking about even if a person does a b'shaygig, inadvertently. Nevertheless, in this scroll there was a chiddush that there was only one liability, one chatas for all malachis. Says, how could that be so? Achas v'suloi, only one and no more. V'atanan, but haven't we learned in the Mishnah? Avos malachis, arbaim chasa achas. So the Mishnah lists for us all the malachis, and the Mishnah tells us what is the number, what is the total? 40 minus 1. V'avinima, we had a kasha. Minyan alamli, why does the Mishnah need to give us a number? We can simply read through the list. Why does the Mishnah need to give us the number as well? He's coming to teach us something. Shim asan kulam belam achas. The Mishnah is telling us, is hinting to us that if one should transgress all those malachis in one period of unawareness, chayav akalachas va'achas. He's chayav a separate chatas for each one. So the Mishnah is telling us that the most chatois, what is the maximum number of chatois a person could be chayav by doing malachis in one helam, is 39. So apparently, Mishnah is teaching us that there are separate liabilities, separate chatois, one for each malacha. So that can't be pshat in the Megillah started. There's only one chatas for all. Says the Gemara, Ema, say as follows: Eina chayav al achas mehem. The Megillah star, this concealed scroll, was referred to chiv misa, doing it b'mezid. And the chiddush here is that there is a specific malacha here that does not result in a chiv misa. Now it's unknown; we're uncertain as to which one it's speaking about. Says the Gemara, but we do know something. Rabbi Yehuda, so according to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, which was that the Mekoshish received Misa due to him doing the Malacha of Maver for Amos Rabim, apparently Pshitale, to him it's clear, that Maver Chayv, that doing this Malacha results in a Chiv Misa. So this is not one of those that are uncertain. Umasnis, now the Brisa which told us that the Malacha that he did was Toilish, apparently Pshitale, the Toilish Chayv. It is clear to the Brisa that Toilish indeed results in a misa liability. For Rabbi Yaakov, Pshitale the Ma'amar Chayv. Apparently, Rabbi Yaakov, who holds that the Mekoshish, he was over in the Malacha of Ma'amar. Apparently, he holds clear to him that Ma'amar carries it to a misa liability. Mar Savar Hamias Halamasapka. So, according to one of these opinions, he holds that this specific one is not part of the suffix. Mar Savar, the other opinion holds, this other one is mias. In any rate, loy misapka is not part of the uncertainty. So once again, we have a suffix here regarding a specific malacha pertaining to the chiv misa. There's something there amongst the 39 that does not involve misa. We're uncertain which one. Says the Gemara, that these three shittas, these three opinions, evidently hold that their respective malachis certainly entail a chiv misa. They're not part of this uncertainty. Continues the Gemara Tana Rabbanan. So who was this Mekoshish? What was his identity? Mekoshish is Slavchad. He was the person named Slavchad who was from Shevet Menashe. V'cheinu oimer v'ayu b'nei Yisrael b'midbar v'yimtzu ish. The pasuk here refers to the term b'midbar in the wilderness when they found this person. Ulahalul oimer, and further down it says Avinu meis b'midbar. These were the daughters of Slavchad saying that our father died in the midbar. So once again, the term b'midbar is employed. We apply Gzeir Shava, Malahal and Slavchad, just like over there. The Bnei Slavchad were referring to their father. So the Avinu Beis Bamidbar is Slavchad. Afkan here too. Who was the Mekoshish? Slavchad. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. Amar Lai Rabbi Yudah ben Seira. Akiva. Benkach u benkach. Either way, whether it turns out that you're correct or incorrect, Ata Asid Liten Asadin. You're going to be punished and held accountable for revealing the identity of the Mekoshish and associating with Slavchad. Why? If it turns out that you're correct, the Torah concealed the identity of the Mekoshish, and you go ahead and reveal it, you may not do so. And if it turns out that you're incorrect, and you incorrectly attributed the Chilul Shabbos of the Mekoshish to Tzlavchad, if so, atam moitzi laz, tzaddik, you're simply maligning this righteous man. Says the Gemara, what's the problem? Ve'ela hagam Gzeir Shava. Rabbi Akiva didn't make it up on his own. He learned it from Gzeir Shava, the Torah itself reveals the identity of Mekoshish. Says the Gemara, Gzeir Shava legamar. Rabbi Yudah ben Seira did not receive this Gzeir Shava from his teachers, and therefore he didn't agree with it. Says the Gemara, Ella. Now, according to Rabbi Yudah ben Seira, Ella mehecha hava. What chet, what sin did Slavchad commit? The Torah says that he died due to a sin. Ki bechetoi meis. So what did he commit? Says the Gemara, he belonged to those people. Miviyapilu hava. He belonged to those people who ascended defiantly up to the mountain. This was after the Meraglim, the spies, returned, and the Klal Yisrael felt bad that they believed their report, so they wanted to charge ahead into Eretz Yisrael against Moshe Rabbeinu's and Hashem's wishes. So they charged up the mountain, and they were killed by the Kananim, the Amalekim. So that was the chet that he committed. As Rashi says, this is not as severe as Chilul Shabbos. So Yudah ben Seira maintains that it was simply this sin that Slavchad committed, but certainly not the chet of Chilul Shabbos. He was not the Mekoshish. Okay, time for a brief review of today's daf. We began with 4 concepts pertaining to a klicheres. If it is a gisera, a broken piece, then as soon as it leaks, mashka, it is tar. When it comes to hechshes roim, something planted within this kli, this flower pot, and the flower pot has a hole, so the plants which are growing within it are not susceptible to tumah. Now, what size hole is necessary to grant the content the status? We have machlekes, either a very small hole the size of a small root, or alternatively a large size hole the size of a pomegranate. We learned that a klicheres, which gets punctured the size of a zayis, so the hole is large enough to allow aleph to slip through, that klicheres is completely tar. However, when it comes to Tamid Puzzle, if it is protected with a seal, it can protect its content even in oil mace. Even if it's punctured and perforated, as long as the breakage encompasses less than the majority of the kli. We proceeded with the Mishnah that taught us that if one throws an object from one rishus to the other, is chayiv. However, if he throws from rishus yachid to rishus yachid through the airspace of rishus rabbim, according to Akiva, is chayiv. According to Chacham, he's pater. The Chacham will agree that if he is moished, if he transfers, if he passes an object from one rishus yachid to the other rishus yachid, passing over the airspace of rishus rabbim, provided that they are situated along the length of rishus rabbim, due to achas, they are chayiv. The person who transferred it is chayiv because it is learned, it resembles the work, the labor, in which the Levium would transfer the beams. They would transfer it from one rishus yachid to the other, from one wagon over to the other wagon situated behind it, along the length of rishus rabbim. The Gemara told us that although Haitzah is considered to be an Av because that is learned from a pasuk of Moshe Rabbeinu telling them to stop bringing their malacha to rishus rabbim, however, Zrika and achnasa, and finally the concept of transferring farmers. Imshus Rabim, they are considered to be teilades. Zrika Tosis says is a svara. Hachnasa, the Gemara says is a svara, and the Dal Damashus Rabim that is learned from Melachim Hashem Sinai. The Gemara concluded with the story of the Mekoshesh Eitzim B'Yom Shabbos, who according to Rekiva was actually tzlavchat. We have three opinions which melacha he did. Either he carried Farmashus Rabim Maver, or he did the melacha of Toilish by detaching the wood, or gathering the wood, which entails the melacha of Mamer.